I stepped onto the executive floor, completely certain I was about to be fired. Pushing open the heavy boardroom doors, the air vanished from my lungs. Sitting at the head of the table was the embarrassed old man from the diner 11 days ago. Only today, he was not wearing a faded cap. He sat in a pristine military dress uniform, radiating the kind of absolute, terrifying power that could either crush my career or save my life. My name is Alice Morris, and on a humid Tuesday morning, I was absolutely certain I was walking to my own professional execution. The elevator ride up to the executive floor of the Southeastern Harbor Renewal Office felt like a slow crawl to the gallows. We were housed in one of those aggressively renovated brick buildings in downtown Charleston, South Carolina, a place where the air conditioning always ran 10 degrees too cold to mask the smell of old harbor money and new corporate anxiety. I clutched my notepad against my chest, my knuckles entirely white. You do not get called up to the top floor on a random Tuesday unless you have either saved the agency millions or you are being escorted out of the building by security. And given the way my department head, Martin Greer, had avoided my eyes all morning, I knew I was not receiving a medal. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the main boardroom. The air instantly vanished from my lungs. There were 5 people in the room, but my eyes locked immediately onto the man sitting at the head of the long glass table. My brain completely stalled. It was the old man from the diner. The embarrassed, quiet man with the faded veteran cap who had been standing at the register exactly 11 days ago. Only today, there was no faded cap, there was no threadbare jacket. He sat straight-backed in a pristine, perfectly tailored military dress uniform, 4 stars gleaming on his dark shoulders. He radiated the kind of absolute, terrifying power that sucked the oxygen right out of the room. No one offered a greeting. No one explained why I was standing there, frozen like a deer in headlights. Martin Greer cleared his throat, his voice significantly more grave than his usual mid-level managerial tone. "Sit down, Ms. Morris." I moved toward an empty leather chair, my legs feeling like they were made of wet concrete. Before I even pulled the chair out, before anyone opened a single manila folder on that table, the man at the head of the table looked right into my eyes. "Good morning, Alice," he said. His voice was low, gravelly, and commanded instant obedience from every soul in the room. He did not look at a file. He did not read a name tag. He just knew. A cold spike of realization hit my stomach. This was not a coincidence. The memory of our first meeting hit me with the force of a physical blow, dragging me back 11 days to a miserable, rain-soaked Thursday night. I had just left the office after working a 14-hour shift. My eyes were burning from staring at spreadsheets for the Harbor Haven Initiative, our agency's crown jewel project supposedly building transitional housing for homeless veterans. The numbers had been swimming on my monitor, blurring together until nothing made sense anymore. I was exhausted to my very bones. Instead of going to my empty apartment, I had pulled my wet sedan into the parking lot of the Blue Lantern Diner. It was the kind of establishment that Charleston tourists never found, an authentic slice of working-class America. The neon sign outside sputtered, missing the letter E, so it proudly advertised the Blue Lant RN. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burnt coffee, fried onions, and wet wool. Faded red vinyl booths lined the walls, patched with silver duct tape that caught the harsh fluorescent lighting. Behind the counter, a muted television played a college football replay, the quiet commentary entirely drowned out by the clinking of heavy silverware against thick porcelain plates and the sizzle of the flat-top grill. I was sitting in a corner booth, nursing a lukewarm mug of black coffee and a plate of scrambled eggs I barely had the energy to eat, trying to decompress. That was when I noticed the commotion up at the front register. It was not a loud argument. In fact, the quietness of it was what drew my attention. A man stood at the counter, wearing a faded green jacket and a worn-out baseball cap with a military division logo barely visible on the front. His shoulders were slightly stooped, his hands weathered and rough. The cashier, a tired-looking teenager popping bubblegum, swiped his card for the 3rd time. She sighed loudly, rolling her eyes in a way only teenagers can master. "Declined again, sir. Do you have another card or cash?" The old man checked his worn leather wallet. It was entirely empty. He patted his jacket pockets, pulling out exactly 3 crumpled dollar bills and a few quarters. The digital display on the register read $14.85. The diner suddenly felt incredibly quiet. The 2 truck drivers at the counter stopped talking. A family in the booth nearest to the door openly stared. You could feel the collective gaze of the room shifting toward the register, drawn by the uncomfortable spectacle of someone else's misfortune. The old man did not raise his voice. He did not argue with the cashier or claim the machine was broken. He just stood there, his jaw tightening, looking down at the useless plastic card on the counter. The deep lines on his face seemed to carve deeper as a slow, agonizing flush of humiliation crept up his neck. It was the silent, crushing shame of a proud man who suddenly found himself a public burden. He quietly began to push his bag takeaway container back toward the cashier. "I apologize," he murmured softly. "I seem to have made a mistake." Something in my chest cracked. I spent my days analyzing multi-million-dollar budgets meant to help veterans, pushing papers that felt entirely detached from human lives. Yet here was one of those very men, standing under harsh fluorescent lights, humiliated over the price of a hamburger and fries. I did not want to make a scene. I did not want to perform an act of charity for an audience, turning his embarrassment into my own self-righteous play. I slid out of my vinyl booth, walked up to the register, and stood right next to him. I did not look at the onlookers. I pulled a crisp $20 bill from my purse and handed it directly to the cashier. "Put his meal on this, please," I said quietly, keeping my voice low enough that only the 3 of us could hear. "And keep the change." The cashier blinked, took the money, and handed the man his plastic bag. The old veteran turned to me, his mouth opening slightly. He looked startled, his pride warring with his gratitude. "Ma'am, you do not need to do that," he said, his voice raspy. "I can just leave the food." "It is already taken care of, sir," I replied gently, offering a small, polite smile. "Have a good night. Stay warm out there." I turned away immediately, deliberately cutting off any prolonged interaction. I wanted to give him an out, a way to walk out of that diner with his dignity completely intact without having to perform excessive gratitude for a stranger. I walked back to my cold eggs and slid into my booth, picking up my fork as if nothing had happened. I heard his heavy boots pause near my table before he headed for the exit. I did not look up, pretending to be utterly fascinated by my food, but he did not keep walking. He stopped right beside my table. "Excuse me," he said. The gravelly texture of his voice was unmistakable over the ambient noise of the diner. I finally looked up. He was standing tall now, the slight stoop in his shoulders entirely gone. Under the brim of his faded cap, his eyes were striking. They were a piercing pale blue, sharp and calculating, completely at odds with the confused, embarrassed demeanor he had shown at the register. He was looking at me not just with gratitude, but with an intense, analytical focus, as if he were cataloging my face, my posture, the agency identification badge I had forgotten to take off my lapel. "What is your name?" he asked simply. "Alice," I said, caught slightly off guard by the sheer weight of his gaze. "Alice Morris," he nodded once, a sharp, precise movement. "Thank you, Alice Morris." He turned and walked out into the Charleston rain. At the time, I thought it was just an odd, intense encounter at the end of a very long day. I thought I was just doing one small, decent thing to offset the crushing bureaucracy of my corporate life. Now, staring across the glossy mahogany table at those same piercing blue eyes, framed by the intimidating stars of a 4-star general, the true gravity of that night crashed over me. I had not just bought an old man a burger. I had unknowingly auditioned for something massive, and whatever test he had been running, I had apparently passed. But looking at the grim faces of the executives surrounding me in this frozen boardroom, I had a terrifying sinking feeling that passing his test was about to drag me into a war I was entirely unprepared to fight. I am a mid-level contract analyst. I do not crave the spotlight, nor do I actively seek out the friction of office politics. My domain has always been the quiet, predictable architecture of spreadsheets, the endless, logical rows of data that keep the bureaucratic heart of the Harbor Haven Initiative beating. My job is essentially to be the agency's immune system, meticulously reviewing expenditures, cross-referencing contractor bids, and ensuring every single dollar allocated for transitional housing for homeless veterans actually buys what it is supposed to buy. This program was our golden calf. Across the state, the initiative was being aggressively championed as a flawless model of urban renewal and veteran support. The board of directors loved it. The local politicians loved it. Therefore, the internal mandate was clear. Though never explicitly written down, the numbers had to reflect that love. Every decimal point had to align with the narrative of total, unmitigated success. Every quarterly report had to be exceptionally smooth, free of any friction that might invite unwanted audits. We were all silently pressured to believe that this project, by virtue of its noble cause, was simply not allowed to have systemic problems. Then came Grant Talbot. He arrived as our new executive director, bringing with him the scent of expensive, subtle cologne and the polished veneer of a man who belonged on the cover of a corporate strategy magazine. Talbot was flawlessly polite. His tailored suits never seemed to wrinkle, even after an 8-hour day. His smiles were mathematically precise, deployed exactly when necessary to disarm a hostile board member or charm a local journalist. He possessed an uncanny, almost theatrical ability to stand in front of a room of cynical reporters and feed them exactly the optimistic, forward-leaning buzzwords they needed for their evening broadcasts. But inside the confines of the agency, the atmosphere shifted radically within a mere 7 days of his arrival. The casual morning catch-ups by the coffee machine evaporated. Meetings, which used to be collaborative problem-solving sessions, became brief. Clinical affairs that felt more like depositions. The air conditioning always seemed to run a little colder when he walked past a row of cubicles. Our inboxes were suddenly choked with dense, multi-paragraph emails outlining new, highly restrictive protocols for internal communications. Under Talbot's regime, a simple formatting inconsistency was no longer treated as a typo. It was swiftly documented as a concerning indicator of unprofessionalism. The threat of his calm, polite disappointment hung over the office like a heavy, invisible fog. I noticed his specific fixation almost immediately. Talbot was obsessed with the narrative. He demanded absolute, suffocating control over the verbiage in every outgoing report, specifically any document detailing the expenditure of the veteran support funds. I once watched him kick back a 60-page financial summary to the accounting team simply because he disliked the word discrepancy and preferred the phrase minor reconciliation variance. Naomi Cross saw right through it. Naomi was a senior compliance officer who had been with the agency for nearly 2 decades. She had survived 4 different executive directors by blending into the beige walls, keeping her files immaculate, and never speaking louder than a murmur. We were waiting for the temperamental copy machine to finish a massive print job one rainy Tuesday afternoon when she finally leaned in close. "Watch your back with the new guy," Naomi murmured, keeping her eyes fixed on the blinking green light of the printer. The break room smelled faintly of burnt popcorn and stale vanilla creamer, a stark contrast to the sharp tension in her voice. "He just seems very particular about the optics," I replied softly, my eyes scanning the hallway to ensure no one was walking by. I did not want to sound disloyal, even to Naomi. Naomi let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Optics are for politicians. Alice, Talbot is a different breed entirely. He does not fear doing the wrong thing. He only fears leaving a paper trail that proves he did the wrong thing. He is not managing this agency. He is sanitizing the archives." Her chilling words lingered in the back of my mind later that week during my final Friday review. The office had mostly emptied out for the weekend. The only sounds were the distant, rhythmic hum of the server room and the sharp tapping of my own keyboard. I was running a standard compliance check on the construction material expenditures for Phase 2 of the housing project. It should have been a routine sign-off, so I could finally go home. Then I saw the first anomaly. It was a standard purchase order for high-grade structural steel and commercial drywall. The invoice looked completely legitimate at first glance, but the supplier lot number caught my eye. It was a long, complex alphanumeric string. My memory is highly visual, and I knew with absolute certainty I had seen that exact string 30 minutes earlier in a different folder. I opened my previous tab and compared them side by side on my dual monitors. The lot numbers were entirely identical. Usually, in construction logistics, this simply means a split delivery from a single large bulk order. However, when I checked the destination addresses attached to the invoices, a cold, heavy knot formed in the pit of my stomach. The first batch was billed to the veteran housing site on Elm Street. The second batch, bearing the exact same unique identifier, was billed to a completely different project site across town. I dug further, my heart rate beginning to pick up. I pulled up a third invoice from a supposedly unrelated subfolder managed by a different contractor. There it was again, the exact same lot number, billed to a third location. 3 separate, massive payments had been requested and authorized for the exact same physical delivery of materials. Initially, my logical analyst brain tried to rationalize it. It had to be a lazy data entry clerk copying and pasting the wrong fields to save time. It was sloppy, but it was just a clerical error. I clicked deeper into the secure database, pulling up the architectural milestones and the physical receiving signatures to clear up the confusion. I expected to find a messy paper trail that I could easily correct. Instead, the floor seemed to drop out from beneath me. This was no typo. As I meticulously cross-referenced the completion certificates, I realized the signatures from the site foreman were identical. They were not just visually similar, they were pixel-perfect matches, clearly duplicated via PDF editing software and stamped onto different forms to simulate authentic approval. My hands began to shake slightly as I opened the resident allocation lists for these supposedly completed units. The names of the veterans slated to move into these newly renovated spaces were listed sequentially, looking perfect on paper. But when I ran a quick, unauthorized background query on 3 of the names through a separate state database, the results made the blood drain from my face. 2 of the Social Security numbers belonged to individuals who had been flagged as deceased for over 4 years. The files were being systematically scrubbed and beautified. Ghost materials were being bought for ghost buildings, supposedly housing ghost residents, all paid for by very real, heavily protected taxpayer dollars meant for vulnerable veterans. I sat back in my cheap mesh office chair. The soft blue glow of the monitor felt suddenly glaring and hostile, exposing something dark, deliberate, and deeply rotten beneath the polished floorboards of our agency. My entire job was to find discrepancies. That was what they paid me an agonizingly average salary to do. But as I opened a blank email draft to my direct supervisor, Martin Greer, intending to point out the potential clerical overlaps in the billing codes, I felt a strange, terrifying prickle at the back of my neck. I carefully typed out a highly diplomatic, completely neutral inquiry, asking for clarification on the matching lot numbers. I hit send. The digital swoosh of the outgoing message echoed loudly in the painfully quiet office. From the exact moment that email left my outbox, the narrative of my life violently severed itself from the realm of quiet, predictable diligence. The emotional lens of my world zoomed out, shifting rapidly away from the simple reality of a hardworking woman doing a small act of kindness in a diner. It plunged me straight into the center of a high-stakes, incredibly dangerous power game. I did not know the rules yet. I did not know all the players. But looking at the artificially perfect, falsified documents glowing on my screen, I knew with terrifying certainty that I had just walked onto a very dark board, and someone with a polite smile and perfect hair was about to view me as a massive threat that needed to be permanently erased. The weekend offered absolutely no refuge. The glaring discrepancy of those duplicated lot numbers and the haunting reality of deceased veterans listed on active housing rosters played on a continuous loop in my mind. By the time Monday morning arrived, I was sitting at my desk a full hour before the overhead fluorescent lights automatically switched on. The silence of the empty office was heavy, almost oppressive, but I needed the quiet. I needed to pull the thread. I dove straight back into the contractor database, ignoring the growing pile of routine approvals in my inbox. I began to map the flow of capital over the last 6 months. Very quickly, a distinct, undeniable pattern emerged. One specific vendor name kept appearing on the ledger like a stubborn, invasive weed choking out the rest of the garden. The name was Liberty Crest Development. According to the internal system, Liberty Crest was swallowing up massive subcontracts for the transitional housing renovations at an alarming rate. What terrified me was the complete absence of competitive bidding. There were no competing proposals attached to their files. There were no standard market rate comparisons. Millions of dollars were being directly awarded to them, rubber-stamped by the executive suite under the convenient, unquestionable guise of expedited veteran relief. It was a blank check masquerading as an emergency mandate. The official vendor profile painted Liberty Crest as a robust, highly seasoned construction firm specializing in subsidized housing. It looked perfect on paper. But I had spent years hunting for the tiny flaws in perfect paperwork. I dug into the archived vendor registration forms from 2 years prior and found a physical contact number listed under an old administrative contact. I picked up my desk phone, the plastic receiver feeling strangely cold against my ear, and dialed the 10 digits. I expected the gruff voice of a site foreman or the bustling background noise of a busy dispatch center. Instead, I got 2 sharp rings followed by the sterile, pre-recorded voice of an automated commercial real estate directory. When a live leasing agent finally picked up, her tone was bored and heavily rehearsed. I politely asked to be connected to the main office of Liberty Crest Development. The agent paused, the sound of her typing echoing softly down the line. Then, she casually dismantled the illusion. She informed me, in a completely flat voice, that the suite number I had provided belonged to an empty commercial rental space. It had been completely vacant for 18 months. My stomach plummeted. I hung up the phone without saying goodbye. I was staring at a screen that claimed a company was actively pouring concrete and hanging drywall at this very second. Yet they did not even have a physical desk to sit at. I went straight to the completion reports. If the company was a ghost, what exactly were we paying them to build? I pulled up the mandatory site inspection photographs submitted for a supposedly completed property on Oak Avenue, and then opened the folder for a completely different site on Pine Street, submitted 4 weeks apart. I dragged the windows side by side on my dual monitors. At a passing glance, they looked like standard, unremarkable apartment interiors, white walls, beige carpet, cheap aluminum blinds. But I leaned in closer, my eyes darting back and forth between the 2 images. It was the scuff mark on the baseboard. It was shaped exactly like a jagged crescent moon. It was present in the Oak Avenue photo, located precisely 3 inches from the corner. In the Pine Street photo, supposedly taken miles away, the exact same scuff mark sat in the exact same spot. I kept looking. The weird, slightly downward tilt of the ceiling fan blade was identical. The shadow cast by the window frame fell at the exact same angle. They were not 2 different apartments. They were the exact same physical room. Someone had merely walked into a single unit, photographed it from a slightly lower angle, applied a subtle color correction filter to make the paint look slightly warmer, and submitted it as a completely new finished construction site. We were paying hundreds of thousands of dollars for an optical illusion. I printed the photographs on the high-resolution color printer. The warm pages felt heavy in my hands. I had to go up the chain of command. Martin Greer, my direct manager, was a man who practically worshipped compliance metrics. He lived for the rules, I believed, perhaps naively, that seeing undeniable proof of fabricated evidence would force him into action. I walked into his glass-walled office and gently laid the prints on his desk. I explained the single apartment masquerading as 2, the ghost office of Liberty Crest, and the duplicated invoices from Friday. I waited for the outrage. I waited for him to grab his phone and demand an immediate meeting with the state auditor. Instead, Martin just stared at the glossy paper. He did not touch the photos. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. The silence in his office stretched out, thick and suffocating. He slowly raised his hand and pushed the photos back across his desk toward me, his fingers trembling slightly. "Alice," he said. His voice had dropped to a hoarse whisper that barely reached my ears. "Do not dig any deeper into this if you do not want to be completely crushed." He refused to meet my eyes. He just turned his chair back toward his monitor. effectively dismissing me. That single, terrified sentence shifted the entire foundation beneath my feet. This was no longer just a glitch in the system. This was a massive, deliberate architecture of fraud, and my own boss was absolutely terrified of the architects. He knew exactly what was happening, and he had chosen survival over integrity. The retaliation came faster than I could have ever anticipated. Less than 24 hours later, my desk phone rang. It was the executive suite. Grant Talbot wanted to see me. I walked into his expansive office, my muscles tight, bracing myself for a confrontation about Liberty Crest or the fake photographs. Talbot was seated behind his massive, immaculate glass desk, looking flawlessly calm. The morning sunlight caught the expensive fabric of his suit. He offered me a seat with a perfectly practiced, utterly hollow smile. He never mentioned the invoices. He never brought up the phantom contractors or the dead veterans on our rosters. Instead, he reached into a drawer and handed me a single sheet of heavy stock paper. It was an off-cycle performance evaluation. I read the words printed on the page, my jaw tightening so hard my teeth ached. For 7 years, my meticulous nature had been praised in every single review. I was celebrated as detail-oriented, thorough, and dedicated. Now, under Talbot's elegant signature, those exact traits had been maliciously weaponized against me. I was suddenly classified as stubborn and inflexible. The document stated I displayed a concerning inability to integrate with the new leadership's streamlined vision, and that my communication style was combative. "We need team players, Alice," Talbot said smoothly. His tone was laced with a synthetic, polite concern that made my skin crawl. "We need people who facilitate progress, not those who create unnecessary friction with uncooperative attitudes. I am sure you understand how vital a cohesive environment is to our mission. I hope we understand each other going forward." He was not reprimanding me for doing a bad job. He was threatening me for doing my job too well. My questions were not a symptom of diligence to him. They were a highly contagious disease he was aggressively trying to quarantine. I nodded once, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me argue, and walked out of his office. I returned to my cubicle, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I knew what I had to do. I immediately reached for my mouse, intending to pull down the remaining expenditure appendices for Liberty Crest. I needed to download local copies of everything. I needed hard, undeniable proof before it all vanished. I double-clicked the shared network drive on my desktop. A harsh gray dialog box instantly popped up on the center of my screen. "Access denied. You do not have the required permissions to view this folder. Please contact your system administrator." I hit refresh. The same gray box mocked me. I typed in the direct file path. "Access denied." Just 3 hours ago, I had full administrative read access to the entire financial backend. Now, the digital doors were slamming shut right in front of my face, locking me out of the very files I was hired to monitor. The air in the office suddenly felt incredibly thin, as if someone had turned off the ventilation. I looked around at the rows of gray partitions. My colleagues were staring at their screens, sipping coffee, typing emails. Everything looked completely normal. No one was yelling. There were no dramatic threats being shouted across the room. There were no physical weapons drawn. I sank back into my chair, staring at the access denied message. I was not defeated yet, but a heavy, suffocating realization settled permanently onto my chest. I was standing at the absolute edge of a very deep, very dark hole. And I finally understood the terrifying, modern nature of this specific war. They were never going to fight me in the light. They were never going to fire me in a loud, dramatic showdown. They were going to slowly, methodically destroy me in the shadows, using the quiet, lethal weapons of corporate bureaucracy. My career, my reputation, and perhaps my freedom were going to be dismantled by silent access revocations, polite but damning performance reviews, forged electronic signatures, and the lifeless, sanitized minutes of meetings I would never be invited to attend. The psychological warfare did not begin with a loud confrontation. It started with a slow, agonizing drip of digital gaslighting that made me question my own sanity. I began to feel the heavy, invisible weight of being constantly watched. My meticulously organized calendar suddenly became a minefield. Critical project syncs were quietly rescheduled 45 minutes earlier without any notification ping, leaving me sprinting into conference rooms late and breathless, while my colleagues stared at me with varying degrees of pity and annoyance. Emails I distinctly remembered sending to the legal compliance team completely vanished from my sent folder. Whenever I submitted formal, written inquiries regarding the missing vendor bids, the responses were either entirely absent or consisted of vague, looping corporate jargon from unmonitored administrative addresses. I was being systematically isolated, walled off by a fortress of automated replies and silent screens. The digital isolation soon bled into the physical world. On a crisp Thursday morning, I walked down to the basement level to manually pull a physical file from the central archives. I swiped my plastic identification badge against the black scanner by the heavy steel door. Instead of the familiar, reassuring green flash and the heavy click of the unlocking mechanism, the scanner blinked a harsh, solid red. I swiped it again, red. I wiped the magnetic strip on my slacks and tried a third time, red. A cold sweat broke out across my collarbone. I immediately marched up to the Human Resources Department, my pulse hammering in my throat. The young representative at the front desk barely looked up from her dual monitors, her voice completely devoid of any real concern. She clicked her mouse twice and offered a painfully rehearsed smile, stating it was merely a routine system update and that my clearance would be restored in 24 to 48 hours. I knew she was lying. We both knew she was lying. My access was not updating. It was being surgically amputated. The true depth of their orchestration revealed itself later that afternoon during a massive cross-departmental budget review. The room was packed with department heads, regional directors, and project managers. Grant Talbot stood at the front, his posture relaxed, a laser pointer casually twirling in his fingers. He was guiding the room through the quarter-end projections, his voice a soothing baritone of manufactured confidence. Then, he clicked to the next slide. A massive, glaring red column appeared on the projection screen, indicating a severe delay in the financial reconciliation for Phase 2. The entire room went dead silent. Talbot let out a soft, highly theatrical sigh. He turned his gaze directly toward my seat at the back of the room. His eyes were cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of mercy. He announced, with a tone of gentle disappointment, that the Phase 2 audit was unfortunately stalling because the primary contract analyst had failed to submit the finalized expenditure reports on time. He did not explicitly say my name, but the collective shift of 20 pairs of eyes turning to look at me did the job perfectly. I sat frozen, staring at the massive spreadsheet projected on the wall. The numbers were wrong. The timestamps were wrong. I had submitted that exact report 3 days ago, completely balanced and fully annotated. But the file currently displayed on the screen, bearing my name in the author field, was missing an entire column of data. Someone had actively accessed my submitted workbook, deleted crucial figures to manufacture a critical error, and then saved it to look like my own gross negligence. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to declare that the file had been tampered with, but the words died in my throat. Who would believe me? The metadata on the screen pointed directly to me. If I shouted about a conspiracy in a room full of executives, Talbot would not even need to fire me. They would just quietly recommend I take a medical leave for stress. I swallowed the bitter, metallic taste of injustice and remained perfectly silent, absorbing the public humiliation. The moment the meeting adjourned, I rushed back to my cubicle. I needed to act. I plugged a small, encrypted thumb drive into the back of my computer tower, desperate to download the original, uncorrupted drafts I had saved locally. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the drive twice. I finally got it inserted and reached for my mouse. Before the icon even appeared on my screen, 2 men from the information technology department silently stepped into my workspace. They were not smiling. The taller one simply reached over, unplugged my machine from the wall, and stated that my laptop and tower were being temporarily confiscated for a mandatory security check regarding a potential data leak. They packed my hardware into a black plastic bin and walked away, leaving me sitting at an empty, hollow desk. My heart slammed against my ribs like a trapped bird. My lifeline, my evidence, my only defense completely gone in a matter of 30 seconds. I walked to the break room, feeling entirely unmoored, gasping for a steady breath. The room was empty except for Naomi Cross. She was standing by the sink, aggressively scrubbing a coffee mug. She did not look at me. She did not say a word. But as she walked past me to leave the room, she deliberately bumped her shoulder against mine. A folded piece of stiff printer paper slipped from her hand and landed softly on the counter next to my elbow. I waited until the door clicked shut before I snatched the paper and locked myself in a bathroom stall. I unfolded it with trembling fingers. It was an old, faded printout of a payment reconciliation ledger from 4 months ago. It looked entirely unremarkable until I noticed a faint string of alphanumeric text highlighted in yellow near the bottom margin. It was an internal routing code. I knew the architecture of our database intimately. This specific routing sequence had been completely wiped from the current electronic registry. It was a ghost code. I pulled out my personal cellular phone, disconnected from the office wireless network, and accessed the state property tax portal. I manually typed in the property identification digits associated with that ghost code. I expected to see another rundown lot designated for veteran housing. The page loaded. The address listed was not in the industrial district or the designated renewal zones. It was a prime, highly coveted address located directly on the waterfront. I pulled up the street view. I was staring at a rendering of a luxury, high-rise condominium complex boasting panoramic ocean views and private rooftop terraces. The ledger Naomi had given me showed hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing out of the Harbor Haven Initiative, explicitly categorized as disability access renovations. But the money was actually being piped directly into the construction of commercial, high-end real estate. The audacity of the theft made me physically nauseous, but the final, crushing blow came when I scrutinized the bottom right corner of Naomi's printout. Below the routing numbers, printed in crisp, undeniable black ink, were 2 physical copies of disbursement orders authorizing the massive transfer of those funds. I stared at the authorization line, my vision blurring, my lungs refusing to expand. There, scrawled perfectly on the dotted line, was my own signature. I had never seen those documents in my life. I had never authorized a single dime for that waterfront address. The loops, the pressure, the exact slant of the letters. It was a flawless, terrifyingly precise forgery. The walls of the bathroom stall seemed to shrink rapidly, pressing in on me until I could barely breathe. The scattered puzzle pieces violently snapped together, forming a picture so horrifying it paralyzed me. Talbot's manufactured errors, the revoked access, the confiscated computer, the public humiliation. They were not doing this to force me to quit. They were not doing this to simply shut me up. They were building a cage. They were systematically planting a dense, inescapable forest of fake evidence directly around my desk. When the federal auditors inevitably came looking for the millions of missing dollars, Talbot and his invisible partners would simply step aside and point at the rogue, disgruntled, incompetent contract analyst who had been secretly siphoning funds. They did not just want to fire Alice Morris. They were actively preparing to send me to federal prison. The heavy boardroom doors clicked shut behind me, sealing me inside a space that felt entirely devoid of oxygen. The initial paralyzing shock of recognizing the old man from the rainy Thursday night had barely begun to subside, replaced by a sharp, metallic taste of genuine fear. I had walked onto this executive floor fully prepared to be stripped of my security badge, handed a cardboard box, and escorted out by building security. I had braced myself for a termination speech delivered by Grant Talbot. Instead, I was standing in front of General Walter Hale. I knew the name immediately, even if I had never seen the face in our internal newsletters. General Hale was a retired 4-star commander, a man whose reputation for ruthless efficiency and absolute moral rigidity was legendary. More importantly, he had recently been appointed as a special independent advisor to the Oversight Board for the Harbor Haven Initiative. He was the apex predator of our bureaucratic ecosystem, and he was sitting right in front of me, his hands folded neatly on the polished mahogany table. The silence in the room was weaponized. Martin Greer, my direct supervisor, sat frozen in a corner chair, looking as though he wished he could sink straight through the floorboards. General Hale did not offer a comforting smile. He did not extend a hand. He simply watched me with those pale, calculating blue eyes. "Take a seat," Hale commanded. It was not a request. I pulled out a heavy leather chair and sat down, keeping my spine perfectly straight. My hands were trembling slightly, so I clasped them tightly in my lap to hide the movement. "I assume you have deduced that our previous encounter at the diner was not the reason you were summoned here today," Hale said, his gravelly voice cutting through the sterile hum of the air conditioning. "However, it is the reason I'm speaking to you directly, rather than having corporate counsel handle your interrogation. I do not remember you because you purchased my dinner. I remember you because you executed a transaction to alleviate a problem, and you did it while actively trying to ensure absolutely no one saw you do it. You did not want credit. You wanted the problem solved." He leaned forward slightly, the golden buttons on his dark dress uniform catching the overhead light. "We are currently facing a very large problem, and I need to know if you are still the kind of person who prefers solving things in the dark." Before I could even attempt to process the magnitude of his statement, Hale reached out and slid a thick, unmarked manila folder across the glossy surface of the table. It stopped precisely in front of me. "Open it," he instructed. I flipped the heavy cardboard cover open. My breath caught in my throat. Inside was a stack of high-resolution printed documents. They were the exact financial records I had been desperately trying to salvage before my computer was confiscated. There were the duplicated purchase orders for Liberty Crest Development. There were the site inspection photographs with the identical scuff marks on the baseboards. And right on top, glaring at me like a physical threat, were the two massive capital disbursement authorizations for the luxury waterfront condominiums. Both of them bore my forged signature in crisp black ink. Hale did not give me time to panic. He leaned back in his chair, his posture rigid and commanding. He fired 3 questions at me in rapid, clinical succession, his tone completely devoid of warmth. "Did you authorize those specific capital disbursements?" "No, sir," I answered immediately, my voice surprisingly steady despite the violent hammering of my heart. "I have never seen those documents before today. Have you been explicitly or implicitly pressured by any member of the executive leadership to alter, omit, or manufacture compliance metrics?" "Yes, sir. I was given a punitive performance evaluation for refusing to overlook duplicated invoices, and my network access to the primary ledger was subsequently revoked." Hale's eyes narrowed slightly, locking onto mine. "Do you currently possess any uncorrupted source documents or hard copies to substantiate these claims?" I swallowed hard, the memory of the 2 men carrying my laptop away still fresh and agonizing. "No, sir. The Information Technology Department confiscated my hardware 2 hours ago under the pretense of a security sweep. But I know exactly where the ghost routing codes point, and I know exactly who handed me the physical ledger that proves the funds were diverted." I sat perfectly still, waiting for the trap to spring. I suddenly realized this was not a rescue mission. General Hale was not here to pat me on the back and tell me everything would be fine. This was a crucible. He was holding the very documents that could send me to federal prison for decades, and he was testing me. He was measuring my spine, calculating whether I had the courage to tell the absolute truth while looking directly at the sheer power that could easily crush me. If I had flinched, if I had tried to lie to protect myself or my colleagues, he would have let the system devour me. Hale held my gaze for 10 long seconds. Then, he gave a single, slow nod. "I was authorized by the Oversight Committee to initiate a shadow audit of the Harbor Haven Initiative 3 months ago," Hale revealed, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "We suspected a structural hemorrhage of federal funds. However, the internal architecture of your database is highly compartmentalized. The perpetrators are meticulous. We were tracking a slow bleed, but we lacked a definitive focal point." He tapped a thick, scarred finger against the edge of the manila folder. "Then, exactly 5 days ago, your name suddenly erupted across our security monitors. You became a glaring anomaly. You were querying restricted subfolders. You were pulling archived vendor registrations. And precisely at the moment you began asking questions, the Phase 2 financial architectures began to aggressively self-destruct. Logs were wiped. Approvals were rerouted. And your digital signature suddenly appeared on transactions you never initiated. He paused, letting the crushing reality of his words settle over me. They are cleaning house, and they are using you as the incinerator. Before I could respond, the heavy mahogany doors clicked open. Grant Talbot stepped into the boardroom. He looked immaculate, as always. His tailored suit was flawless, his hair perfectly styled, and he carried a sleek leather portfolio under one arm. He wore an expression of polite, professional urgency, clearly assuming this was a standard, high-level briefing regarding my pending termination. My apologies for the slight delay. Gentlemen, Talbot said smoothly, his eyes scanning the room as he closed the door. I was just wrapping up a press call regarding our latest housing milestones. Now, regarding the situation with our analyst. Talbot's sentence died in his throat. His polished, predatory gaze shifted from my seated figure to the head of the table. I watched, with a grim, deeply satisfying fascination, as the flawless corporate mask completely shattered. It only took about 3 seconds. For 3 seconds, Grant Talbot stared at the 4 stars gleaming on General Walter Hale's shoulders, and the blood rapidly drained from his perfectly tanned face. He recognized him instantly. He realized, with sudden, terrifying clarity, that the Oversight Board had not sent a malleable corporate lawyer to review the files. They had sent a war commander. Talbot swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply. General Hale, I was not informed you would be joining us on site today. My schedule is highly fluid. Mr. Talbot, Hale replied. His voice was entirely flat, offering absolutely zero professional courtesy. He did not invite Talbot to sit down. I held my breath, waiting for Hale to slide the forged documents across the table. I waited for the general to announce an immediate federal indictment, to order security to strip Talbot of his credentials and march him out into the Charleston heat. I wanted the immediate, explosive vindication, but it never came. Hale calmly closed the manila folder and rested his hands on top of it. He looked at Talbot with an expression of mild, calculated indifference. I was just reviewing some preliminary compliance methodologies with your analyst, Hale said smoothly, telling a lie so perfect and bold it sent a shiver down my spine. We are implementing a new, secondary reporting structure for the final phase of the transition grants. I trust you will ensure she has unrestricted access to whatever archives she requires moving forward. Talbot looked like a man who had just swallowed glass. He glanced at me, his eyes burning with a sudden, venomous hatred, before carefully rearranging his features back into a neutral, agreeable mask. Of course, General. Full transparency is our highest priority. Excellent, Hale stated, standing up and effectively dismissing the executive director of the entire agency. That will be all for today. Keep up the good work. Grant. Talbot gave a stiff, jerky nod and practically fled the room. I sat in my chair, my mind spinning violently. I looked up at Hale, completely bewildered. He had the proof. He had the forged signatures. Why did he just let the man walk away? Hale looked down at me, his expression hardening back into forged steel. If I cut off his head today, the rest of the network scatters, and the money disappears offshore by midnight, Hale said quietly. He is a single piece on the board. We are going to take the entire board. He slid the heavy folder back across the table, closer to my hands. You are going back to your desk. Alice, you are going to smile, and you are going to continue your work. You are now my designated eyes inside the network. A cold, heavy knot formed in my stomach as the true nature of his strategy washed over me. This was the new, terrifying twist in the snare. Talbot was not destroyed. He was wounded, paranoid, and highly dangerous, and he now knew that I was sitting at the table with the one man who could end his life of luxury. I was not just a protected witness. From this exact second forward, I was shoved directly into the center of a lethal corporate crossfire. I was the bait, I was the target, and the hunt had officially begun. I expected Grant Talbot to storm into the bullpen the moment General Hale stepped onto the private executive elevator. I sat at my desk, my muscles tightly coiled, bracing myself for a screaming match, a public spectacle of executive rage, or an immediate escort out of the building by armed security. But men like Talbot do not yell. They do not lose their temper in front of an audience. They suffocate you with procedure. The retaliation was terrifyingly quiet, entirely bloodless, and clinically precise. Less than 2 hours after the heavy boardroom doors closed, my desk telephone rang. It was not Talbot. It was Human Resources. I was summoned to the second floor, where Marlene Pike, the Senior Director of Employee Relations, sat across from me with a perfectly neutral, highly practiced expression. She pushed a thick-sealed manila envelope across her immaculate desk. Her voice was devoid of any human empathy as she informed me that I was officially placed on indefinite administrative leave, effective immediately, pending a comprehensive internal investigation. A formal ethics violation had been permanently lodged in my personnel file. The document boldly cited willful and unauthorized access to highly classified proprietary folders well outside the scope of my daily contractual duties. It was a masterpiece of corporate gaslighting. They were accusing me of the exact crime they had committed to frame me. I was ordered to surrender my company-issued cellular telephone, my physical security badge, and my parking pass right there on the spot. Tossing that small plastic badge onto her desk felt like surrendering my entire professional identity to a thief. The walk back to my desk to collect my personal belongings felt like wading through deep, freezing water. The office, usually buzzing with the dull hum of keyboard clicks, the scent of cheap printer ink, and muted telephone conversations, went entirely silent as I passed the rows of gray fabric partitions. I was practically radioactive. People I had eaten lunch with for 5 years, colleagues whose birthdays I had celebrated, suddenly found the lint on their carpets completely fascinating. No one met my eyes. No one whispered a single word of support or asked what had happened. The isolation was absolute and suffocating. They were terrified of the polite, smiling man on the executive floor, and they were actively choosing their mortgages and their quiet, safe lives over my professional execution. I carried my small cardboard box out to the employee parking garage. The heavy concrete structure echoed with the hollow sound of my own footsteps. The humid South Carolina air wrapped around me like a wet blanket, thick and oppressive. I had just reached the trunk of my sedan, fumbling for my car keys, when a shadow detached itself from behind a thick concrete pillar. I nearly dropped my box. It was Martin Greer. My direct supervisor looked utterly exhausted. His tie was loosened, his collar unbuttoned, and his shoulders slumped heavily beneath the weight of his own profound cowardice. He glanced frantically around the empty garage, his eyes darting toward the security cameras mounted near the exit ramps. He confessed, his voice barely a rasp echoing off the concrete, that he was the one who had altered the system logs on the budget reports. Talbot had cornered him the previous week, systematically threatening to dismantle his entire pension plan and blacklist him from the state government sector if he did not manually adjust the timestamps to make me look completely negligent. "I am so sorry, Alice," Martin whispered, refusing to look me directly in the eye, his gaze fixed on the asphalt between my shoes. "He has the entire oversight committee in his pocket. I have 2 kids in college. I have 20 years invested in this state system. I could not let him ruin my family." I felt a sudden, blinding flash of white-hot anger, but it cooled almost instantly into a hardened, cynical pity. Martin was not the architect of this nightmare. He was just another terrified brick in Talbot's wall. However, Martin had not risked creeping into the parking garage solely to absolve his own guilt. His hand trembled violently as he reached into his suit jacket pocket and pulled out a tiny, black electronic flash drive. He pressed it quickly into the palm of my hand, his fingers completely ice-cold. It was an audio recording from an emergency executive huddle he had secretly captured on his phone. He told me it contained Talbot explicitly instructing the compliance team to ensure every single fraudulent digital signature pointed exactly to the right disposable person. Me. He had given me a weapon, even if he was too cowardly to wield it himself. I drove away from the harbor, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I drove aimlessly for 45 minutes to ensure I was not being followed, eventually pulling into the gravel parking lot of a quiet, independent coffee shop on the absolute edge of town, far from the polished downtown financial district. Naomi Cross arrived 30 minutes later. She was wearing dark sunglasses and a plain, unremarkable raincoat, looking over her shoulder before pushing through the glass door. She slid into the wooden booth opposite me, immediately sliding a folded architectural map and a thick printed dossier across the sticky table. Naomi had spent the last 48 hours quietly digging through the municipal property registries, tracing the shell corporations backward through layers of legal obfuscation. The truth she uncovered was vastly more sickening than simple embezzlement. Liberty Crest Development was not just a phantom contractor bleeding our renovation budget dry for a few extra $1 million. The shell company was heavily tethered to a massive, aggressive real estate investment trust currently gobbling up vacant lots all along the waterfront. Naomi leaned in, her voice a fierce, hushed whisper as she laid out the entire grotesque vision. If the Harbor Haven Initiative was declared a flawless, accelerated success, the agency could officially document that all the vulnerable veterans had been successfully rehabilitated and relocated to permanent suburban housing. The temporary housing blocks, situated on some of the most incredibly valuable, undeveloped coastal land in the entire city, would no longer be deemed necessary. The zoning board, heavily lobbied by Talbot and his invisible corporate partners, would immediately reclassify the entire district for commercial development. They were not just stealing the paint and the drywall money. They were staging a massive, patriotic theatrical production of veteran recovery solely to justify bulldozing the shelters. They were going to flip the land and build those luxury waterfront condominiums and high-end retail spaces, turning the national gratitude meant for broken soldiers into a massive private windfall. The veterans whose names they had forged, the dead men whose identities they had stolen, were nothing more than convenient stepping stones to prime real estate. I sat back against the wooden booth, the cheap diner coffee turning completely cold in my mug. The sheer, sociopathic scale of the fraud settled over me, extinguishing the last remaining embers of my panic. The fear that had been vibrating in my chest for the past week completely vanished, replaced by something dark, solid, and absolute. Up until this very second, my entire struggle had been purely defensive. I had been desperately fighting to save my own modest salary, to protect my own reputation, and to avoid going to a federal penitentiary for a crime I did not commit. I had been reacting to their moves, scrambling like a terrified mouse in a complex maze they had built specifically to trap me. But looking at the map of the harbor, looking at the parcels of land stained with the blood and trauma of men and women who had fought for this country, my perspective fundamentally shifted. This was no longer about Alice Morris fighting an unfair human resources evaluation. This was about a pack of greedy, polished vultures feeding off the most vulnerable people in our society, wrapping themselves tightly in the American flag while they picked the bones clean. I closed my hand tightly around the small black flash drive Martin had given me, the sharp plastic edges biting into my palm. I realized then that I did not want to just clear my name anymore. I did not want to beg for my job back, and I absolutely did not want a quiet, confidential settlement. I wanted to tear their entire pristine, perfectly manicured kingdom down to the concrete foundation. Grant Talbot had meticulously constructed a beautiful, brightly lit public relations stage for his own glorious victory. My objective was no longer survival. My objective was to force him and every single one of his ghost investors to step out onto that exact stage, into the glaring spotlight, and I was going to be the one to rip the floorboards out from underneath them. The defensive maneuvers were officially over. I was going to build a guillotine out of their own paperwork. I permanently deleted the draft of the appeal letter I had been writing to the Human Resources Department. Begging for my job, pleading for someone to believe my innocence, was a useless strategy designed for a completely fair world. We were not operating in a fair world. We were operating in a slaughterhouse, and I absolutely refused to politely walk myself up the ramp. I needed to stop acting like a terrified victim and start operating like a ruthless prosecutor. To build an airtight case, I needed the digital footprints they thought they had permanently erased. That meant I needed Jordan Vale. Jordan was a systems security specialist who practically lived in the subterranean server farms of our building. He was a notoriously quiet man who wore faded band shirts under dark cardigans and operated strictly by his own rigid, incorruptible moral compass. He actively despised the polished arrogance of the executive suite. I intercepted him outside a heavily graffiti-covered laundromat at exactly 9 o'clock on a Friday night, far away from any corporate surveillance cameras or company networks. He did not ask for a lengthy emotional explanation. When I told him my access had been deliberately severed and false financial files were planted under my credentials, his jaw tightened. He pulled a battered laptop from his canvas messenger bag, tethered it to a secure cellular hotspot, and bypassed the agency firewall using a complex diagnostic backdoor he had intentionally left open for himself years ago. We sat on a cold concrete bench in the humid night air for 2 hours as he waded through the heavily encrypted network archives. The metadata he finally extracted was a massive revelation. It completely dismantled Grant Talbot's entire fabricated narrative. Jordan isolated the exact digital creation markers for the massive capital disbursement orders that bore my forged signature. The raw data definitively proved those specific files were actively generated from a master administrative account at precisely 2:14 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. My heart leaped against my ribs. At that exact minute, on that specific Tuesday, I was sitting in the middle of a mandatory cross-departmental training seminar. There were at least 30 reliable witnesses and 2 perfectly positioned ceiling security cameras that could easily place me on the complete opposite side of the building. Furthermore, Jordan dug deep into the master deletion logs. He found a heavily obscured login sequence that had completely bypassed the standard employee gateway. It originated directly from the static Internet Protocol address permanently assigned to Talbot's private executive office. The login occurred at exactly 3 in the morning on the precise date my original, uncorrupted expenditure appendices violently vanished from the servers. The flawless, untouchable executive director had left arrogant, muddy footprints all over the digital crime scene. Digital proof was a powerful weapon, but I needed undeniable physical reality to make the trap lethal. Naomi had quietly slipped a new, expanded list of supposed residential addresses into my home mailbox. I spent my entire Saturday driving across the city, burning through a full tank of gas to verify the coordinates. I drove to a premium property on West Harbor Boulevard that our official ledger claimed was currently housing 12 disabled veterans. I parked across the street and walked up to the brick building. There were no wheelchair ramps. There were no veterans sitting on the porch. I peered through the dusty front window of a ground floor unit. The interior was completely gutted down to the wooden studs. Shiny new boxes of imported Italian marble tiles were stacked in the center of the living room, waiting to be installed for a high-end, luxury condominium conversion. The beautiful, highly publicized success story of the Harbor Initiative was a massive, completely empty shell designed purely for corporate profit. Exhausted and running entirely on sheer adrenaline, I retreated to the only place in the city that felt disconnected from the sprawling nightmare. I pushed through the glass doors of the Blue Lantern Diner just as the evening rain started to aggressively hit the pavement. I slid into my usual vinyl booth, staring blankly at the menu, and suddenly froze. Sitting 2 tables away, quietly eating a slice of cherry pie with black coffee, was General Walter Hale. He did not look surprised to see me. He did not offer a comforting smile or ask how I was holding up under the crushing, humiliating weight of my suspension. He wiped his mouth with a paper napkin, stood up, and walked directly over to my booth. He did not sit down. He simply stood tall, looked down at me with those terrifying analytical blue eyes, and asked one single penetrating question. Do you want to be saved, or do you want to end this the right way? That single question hit me like a physical shockwave. It fundamentally changed the chemistry of my brain. I suddenly understood his absolute, deafening silence in the boardroom days ago. General Hale was not going to swoop in and magically fix the corrupted system just because I had bought him a hamburger. He was not going to bend the rigid federal rules to offer me a quiet, safe, cowardly exit. But he was actively holding the heavy door open. He would provide the ultimate, unassailable stage, but I had to be the battering ram. I had to bring him the undeniable, bulletproof evidence that would force the corrupt machine to publicly consume itself. I looked back up at the general, my fear entirely replaced by cold clarity, and gave one single, firm nod. He turned and walked out into the rain without another word. The final massive shift on the chessboard occurred the following Sunday morning. My newly purchased prepaid cellular phone violently vibrated against my kitchen counter. The caller identification displayed an unknown local number. When I answered, the voice on the other end was brittle, breathless, and entirely frantic. It was Marlene Pike, the same icy human resources director who had coldly confiscated my badge and handed me my termination papers, was practically hyperventilating. We quickly agreed to meet at a crowded public botanical garden on the edge of town. Marlene was pacing nervously near a large stone water fountain, hiding her face behind oversized designer sunglasses. Her flawless corporate composure was completely shattered. Her hands shook violently as she handed me a heavily creased manila envelope. Inside was a draft of a highly confidential internal memorandum she had secretly intercepted from Talbot's private outbox. Talbot was actively preparing a secondary scorched earth contingency plan in case the state oversight auditors started asking the wrong questions. The document meticulously outlined a false narrative where I had maliciously manipulated the data for personal gain, but it also explicitly stated that Marlene had been grossly negligent in her administrative oversight, effectively allowing the massive security breach to happen. If the ship started taking on water, Talbot was planning to chain Marlene directly to the steering wheel right next to me, ensuring we both drowned while he safely boarded a lifeboat. "He is going to completely destroy both of us," Marlene whispered, her voice trembling with a potent mixture of raw terror and absolute blinding fury. I did exactly what he told me to do. I followed every single order. And he is preparing to feed me to the federal wolves to save his own career. The dynamic of the entire war violently inverted in that exact moment. For the very first time since this nightmare began, I was not just a solitary, paranoid woman thrashing blindly against a massive, invisible, institutional trap. The people who had previously enabled Talbot out of sheer cowardice or blind ambition were abruptly waking up to the horrifying reality that they were entirely disposable assets. I looked at Marlene, realizing she held the ultimate, unrestricted administrative keys to the kingdom. I was no longer fighting this war alone in the dark. I was actively gathering the broken, terrified pieces of Talbot's own machine. Naomi, Jordan, Martin, and now Marlene. I was slowly, meticulously welding them together to form the jagged steel teeth of a massive, inescapable trap of my own. We were going to build a guillotine, and Grant Talbot was going to pull the lever himself. The summons arrived via a sterile, automated calendar invite to my personal email, demanding my presence at a neutral corporate workspace downtown. Grant Talbot did not want me anywhere near the main office for this conversation. When I walked into the rented glass conference room, he was already seated, his posture relaxed, nursing a bottle of sparkling water. He slid a thick, heavily bound stack of legal documents across the sleek table. It was a comprehensive settlement agreement. The terms were brutally simple. I would submit a voluntary, irrevocable letter of resignation citing personal health reasons. In exchange, the agency would officially drop the pending internal investigation regarding the gross mishandling of confidential data. The contract included a draconian non-disclosure clause and a mutual non-disparagement agreement. If I signed it, I would receive a severance package equal to 3 months of my current salary, and the invisible threat of a federal fraud indictment would magically disappear. Talbot leaned forward, his voice a masterclass in synthetic empathy. He told me he understood how stressful the corporate environment could be, how easily numbers could get mixed up when an employee was overwhelmed and overworked. He was offering me a golden parachute, framing himself as the benevolent leader granting mercy to a broken, incompetent subordinate. I looked down at the signature line. 2 weeks ago, I would have burst into tears of sheer panic. I would have desperately pleaded my innocence, but the woman who had cried in her car was completely gone, replaced by someone cold, hollowed out, and entirely focused. I played the part he desperately needed to see. I let my shoulders slump heavily. I stared at the polished floor, ensuring my hands trembled just enough as I picked up the heavy document. I kept my voice small, fragile, and laced with defeat. I whispered that I just wanted the nightmare to be over, but I needed 24 hours to let a labor attorney review the termination clauses. Talbot offered a magnanimous, victorious smile. He granted me 48 hours. He firmly believed he had completely broken my spine. He had no idea I was simply buying time to load the weapon. The moment I stepped out of the building, my burner phone vibrated. General Walter Hale was brief and surgically precise. He had officially leveraged his oversight authority to mandate a closed door, emergency hearing with the primary board of directors. However, he offered a stark, uncompromising warning. He told me the men and women on that board were financial predators, not social workers. They would not ruin their star executive just because I had a compelling story about being bullied. If I walked into that room relying on emotion, they would bury me. The general demanded ironclad, irrefutable mathematics, or he would not let me through the door. My small living room rapidly transformed into a clandestine war room. Jordan Vale arrived shortly after dusk, hauling 2 heavy encrypted laptops and a portable wireless router. We spent 14 agonizing hours constructing a digital timeline so flawless and tight it could withstand a federal cross-examination. Jordan mapped the exact timestamp of every altered budget file directly against the high-definition hallway security footage. The presentation showed my physical body standing in a crowded human resources seminar on the 3rd floor. At the precise second, my digital credentials were actively forging capital disbursement orders in the basement server matrix. We overlaid this with the hidden login pings tracing back to the specific Internet Protocol address registered exclusively to the executive suite. We possessed the digital fingerprints, the murder weapon, and the map of the getaway route. But the final, devastating piece of ammunition came from Naomi Cross. She arrived the next morning, her eyes bloodshot from a severe lack of sleep, carrying a stack of manila folders she had quietly smuggled out of the Regional Veteran Affairs Intake Center. She dropped them onto my coffee table with a sickening thud. I had previously assumed the names listed on our fraudulent Phase 2 housing rosters were simply fabricated identities, ghost names generated by an algorithm to balance the ledgers. Naomi proved me completely wrong, and the truth made my blood run entirely cold. The names were real. The social security numbers were real. Naomi had manually cross-referenced the agency housing roster against the municipal homeless shelter intake logs. The men and women officially listed as currently residing in our newly renovated, million-dollar waterfront properties were actually sleeping on aluminum cots in overcrowded, underfunded city shelters. One of the names belonged to a former Marine who had served 3 combat tours and was currently registered at a soup kitchen 5 miles away from his supposed luxury apartment. Talbot and his shadow investors had not just stolen the money, they had actively harvested the identities of the most broken, vulnerable people in the city. They used the real names of destitute soldiers to legitimize their massive real estate fraud, treating human beings who had bled for this country as nothing more than convenient administrative props to decorate their fake ledgers. The sheer moral depravity of the scheme elevated my mission from a simple act of professional self-preservation to a profound, righteous wrath. This was no longer just about white-collar embezzlement. It was a grotesque violation of human dignity. Marlene Pike provided the final strategic coordinate. She sent a highly encrypted message detailing Talbot's schedule for the end of the week. He was not just waiting for my signature on the settlement, he was preparing to host a massive, heavily publicized press conference in the main atrium of our headquarters. He had invited the local television stations, the mayor, and key political donors to proudly announce the triumphant, early completion of the Phase 2 housing initiative. But Marlene uncovered the real objective hidden beneath the public relations stunt. Immediately following the press conference, the board of directors was scheduled to convene and officially authorize a $1.5 million performance bonus for the executive management team, heavily weighted toward Talbot himself. He was going to stand on a stage, proudly accept the gratitude of the city for helping veterans, and then walk into a back room to personally pocket a fortune built entirely on stolen valor and falsified documents. I stared at the pristine, unsigned settlement agreement sitting on my kitchen counter. The traditional safe route would be to take Jordan's timeline and Naomi's files directly to a federal prosecutor, quietly hand over the evidence, and disappear into the background while the legal system slowly ground Talbot down over the next 3 years. But I did not want a quiet resolution behind closed doors. I did not want anonymous leaks to a newspaper. Grant Talbot had spent weeks systematically humiliating me in front of my colleagues, weaponizing my own diligence, and treating me like a disposable pawn in his elegant sociopathic game. He had built a beautiful, brightly lit stage to crown himself a hero. I packed the flash drives, the architectural maps, and the shelter intake logs into my leather briefcase. I took a long, steady breath, feeling the erratic, terrified pulse that had plagued me for weeks completely smooth out into a slow, icy rhythm. I walked out of my apartment building into the crisp morning air, my face a mask of absolute calm. I was no longer the desperate, cornered woman begging for her career. I was the architect of an impending demolition, and I knew exactly where I was going to detonate the charges. The main atrium of the Southeastern Harbor Renewal Office was entirely transformed by 8 o'clock on a Thursday morning. It no longer looked like a sterile government agency. It looked like a glossy political campaign headquarters. Massive, professionally printed banners hung from the second-floor balconies, proudly proclaiming the premature success of the Harbor Haven Initiative. Local television news crews were actively taping down heavy black cables across the polished marble floors, adjusting their bright camera lights to capture the perfect angles. Caterers quietly circulated with silver trays of expensive pastries and sparkling cider. This was Grant Talbot's crowning achievement, a meticulously manufactured spectacle designed to catapult him into the upper echelons of state politics. He was standing near the front podium, surrounded by a tight cluster of wealthy local donors and carefully selected veteran representatives who had no idea they were simply decorative props in his grand illusion. Talbot looked utterly magnificent. His bespoke charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, his smile was broad and charismatic, and he radiated the intoxicating confidence of a man who firmly believed he had completely outsmarted everyone in the room. When I walked through the heavy glass double doors, the ambient noise of the crowded atrium seemed to briefly mute itself in my ears. I wore a simple, sharply cut navy blazer and a perfectly blank expression. I caught Talbot's eye across the crowded room. For a fraction of a second, his charismatic smile faltered, a flash of genuine irritation crossing his features. He clearly expected me to be at home, quietly packing my bags and reviewing the severance paperwork. But as I offered him a slow, highly submissive nod and lowered my gaze to the floor, his irritation instantly dissolved back into smug satisfaction. He falsely assumed I had arrived to formally surrender, returning to the scene of my defeat to quietly sign the non-disclosure agreement in the Human Resources office upstairs. His arrogance was a heavy, blinding blindfold, and I was counting on it. Beneath my calm exterior, my nervous system was operating at absolute maximum capacity. The margin for error was non-existent. If I misspoke, if a single piece of evidence failed to load, or if my presentation lacked absolute structural integrity, Talbot would instantly pivot. He would expertly play the victim, painting me as a hysterical, disgruntled former employee throwing a desperate tantrum because I had been caught falsifying records. All of my grueling work, and all the risk my colleagues had taken, would instantly evaporate into a pathetic public relations footnote. Jordan Vale had spent the entire night ensuring our digital arsenal was indestructible. He knew Talbot's information technology team might attempt to sever the network connection the moment I went off script. To counter this, Jordan had created 4 redundant, encrypted digital mirrors of our entire presentation. He planted them on external cloud servers, loaded them onto secure physical flash drives currently sitting in my pocket, and even rigged a delayed email trigger. If I did not manually enter a cancellation code by noon, the entire dossier of corrupted files, forged signatures, and ghost contractor identities would automatically blast out to every major investigative journalist in the state. The data was completely unkillable. Marlene Pike had secured the perimeter from the inside, but her allegiance was incredibly fragile. We had met in a subterranean parking garage at 6 o'clock that morning. The usually composed human resources director looked physically ill. She handed me the administrative access codes required to hijack the main projector system in the boardroom, but she grabbed my wrist with terrifying strength before I could pull away. Her condition was absolute. She demanded that the strike be perfectly fatal to his career. If I left Talbot a single administrative loophole, a single shadow of plausible deniability, he would inevitably slither out and burn both of us to the ground to cover his escape. The atmosphere shifted noticeably when General Walter Hale arrived. He did not enter through the main doors with the press. He materialized quietly from the private executive elevators, flanked by 2 solemn aides. He wore his formal dress uniform, the 4 stars gleaming coldly under the bright atrium lights. Talbot immediately broke away from his wealthy donors and practically sprinted across the marble floor to greet him, extending his hand with practiced reverence. Hale accepted the handshake with a single, curt nod. He did not smile. He did not offer any congratulatory remarks. He simply allowed himself to be led toward the VIP seating area in the adjacent glass-walled boardroom where the expanded oversight committee was gathering. Talbot looked thrilled, completely misinterpreting the general's icy silence as a mark of dignified, ceremonial endorsement. Talbot thought he had secured the ultimate military seal of approval for his scam. He did not realize Hale was simply taking a front-row seat to an execution. The tension pulled tighter with every passing minute. 10 minutes before the boardroom doors were scheduled to close for the private executive session, the first unexpected variable hit me. Martin Greer suddenly bumped hard into my shoulder near the coffee station. He muttered a quick, nervous apology for the collision, but as he pulled back, I felt a stiff piece of folded paper slide directly into the side pocket of my blazer. I walked into an empty corridor, checking over my shoulder before unfolding it. My breath caught in my throat. It was not a digital printout. It was a physical photocopy of the original, highly restricted Phase 2 budget proposal from 3 months ago. But what made it a completely lethal weapon were the margins. The edges of the paper were covered in Grant Talbot's distinct, looping handwriting. Written in blue ink were explicit, undeniable instructions to his accounting team. He had written orders to adjust the overhead figures upward by 12% and to ensure Liberty Crest met the threshold for expedited. No bid approval. It was the ultimate smoking gun. It proved Talbot did not just passively overlook the fraud. He had personally, manually ordered the financial manipulation. I folded the paper tight and slipped it into my inner breast pocket, right next to my pounding heart. But the battlefield shifted again just 3 minutes later. Naomi Cross brushed past me, pretending to check her cellular phone. She did not stop walking, but she whispered a frantic, terrifying warning right into my ear as she passed. Talbot knew about the diner. Naomi had intercepted a panicked text message from Talbot's executive assistant. Talbot had somehow acquired the security footage or a witness account of the rainy Thursday night at the Blue Lantern Diner. He knew I had interacted with General Hale before the investigation began. Naomi warned me that Talbot was planning a preemptive strike. If I tried to expose him, Talbot was going to project that footage or mention that meeting to the entire board, twisting my small act of kindness into a malicious conspiracy. He was preparing to accuse me of engaging in an inappropriate, unethical backroom alliance with the general to frame the executive director. He was going to claim the entire audit was a conflict of interest, a targeted hit job orchestrated by 2 people trading personal favors. A cold sweat prickled across the back of my neck. That was why Talbot was so incredibly confident. He believed he held a trump card that would instantly discredit my character and neutralize Hale's authority in one single devastating motion. If Talbot spoke first, if he planted that seed of doubt in the minds of the board members, my spreadsheets and metadata would be dismissed as fabricated revenge. A heavy bell chimed through the atrium speakers, signaling the start of the closed-door board meeting. The press was corralled outside. The heavy mahogany doors of the main conference room were propped open, waiting for the executives and the oversight committee to take their seats. I stood in the hallway, the heavy weight of the flash drives in my pocket, the damning handwritten note against my chest, and the terrifying knowledge of Talbot's trap burning in my mind. The explosive charges were planted everywhere. The room was packed with powerful people entirely ready to write a massive check to a criminal. I had the evidence to destroy him, but I was suddenly walking a razor-thin wire over a bottomless drop. I had to strike first. I had to strike with absolute, terrifying precision, and I had to neutralize his counterattack before he even opened his mouth. I smoothed the lapels of my navy blazer, took one final, deep breath of the air-conditioned corporate air, and walked through the heavy wooden doors. I was ready to burn the house down. Grant Talbot stood at the head of the massive mahogany table, bathing in the warm glow of his own projected presentation. The slides were a masterpiece of corporate fiction, filled with soaring bar graphs, meticulously fabricated budget surpluses, and touching stock photographs of smiling families. He spoke with a practiced velvety cadence, delivering a sickeningly hypocritical monologue about our sacred duty to serve those who have so bravely served us. The wealthy board members nodded along, completely captivated by the polished illusion he had constructed. Just as the chairman of the board raised his gold fountain pen to officially authorize the $1.5 million performance bonus for the executive management team, I stood up from my chair at the back of the room. The legs of my chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. Cutting through the self-congratulatory applause, I formally requested the floor in my capacity as the primary contract reviewer for the Phase 2 initiative. Talbot offered a thin, patronizing smile, gripping the edges of the podium. He graciously told the board to indulge me, clearly assuming I was about to launch into an emotional, tearful plea to save my own reputation before I was escorted out of the building. He thought I was a broken woman making a desperate, pathetic final stand. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or react to his condescension. I walked calmly to the front of the room, unplugged his presentation laptop, and inserted my own encrypted flash drive. The massive screen behind him flashed from a beautiful sunset over a newly painted house to a stark, blindingly white digital timeline. I did not make a speech. I simply let the data speak. I projected the exact server logs, proving my digital signature was actively used to authorize massive funds at exactly 2:14 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. Right beside that undeniable digital footprint, I played the high-definition security video showing my physical body sitting in a crowded human resources seminar on the 3rd floor at that precise second. Then, Jordan's extracted metadata lit up the screen, tracing the forged approvals directly back to the static Internet Protocol address of Talbot's private office. Talbot's charismatic smile instantly vanished, replaced by a tight mask of righteous indignation. He immediately launched his premeditated counterattack, exactly as Naomi had warned me he would. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger at me and then gestured sharply toward General Hale, who was sitting silently in the corner. Talbot loudly accused me of conspiring with the military advisor, claiming we had formed a wildly inappropriate personal alliance during a clandestine meeting at a local diner several weeks ago. He spun a rapid, desperate narrative, telling the board that this entire presentation was a malicious, coordinated hit job orchestrated by a disgruntled employee and a biased investigator trading personal favors. He tried to turn my one act of quiet kindness into a weapon against me. That was the exact moment Grant Talbot stepped directly into his own grave. General Walter Hale did not yell, but when he spoke, the sheer command in his voice sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the room. He stood up slowly, his 4 stars gleaming under the harsh boardroom lights. He formally announced to the shocked executives that the Federal Oversight Committee had secretly appointed him to investigate the harbor project exactly 42 days ago, long before our paths ever crossed in that rain-soaked parking lot. He stated, with absolute surgical precision, that I had simply paid his bill when his card was inexplicably declined, and that I had walked away without ever knowing his true identity or his mission. Talbot's accusation of a premeditated conspiracy crumbled into dust in a matter of seconds. Before Talbot could pivot to a new lie, the second wave of our strike hit him. Marlene Pike stood up from her seat at the side table. Her hands were visibly trembling, but her voice was entirely resolute as she distributed physical copies of Talbot's highly confidential contingency plan to the board members. She exposed his written intent to frame the Human Resources Department to cover his own tracks. Then, Martin Greer pulled his cellular phone from his suit jacket and hit play. Grant Talbot's own voice echoed through the dead silent room, explicitly ordering his compliance team to ensure every single fraudulent signature pointed directly to the right disposable person. Naomi Cross immediately stood up and formally corroborated the audio, confirming the systemic, top-down alteration of the budget ledgers. The room was in a state of shock, but I was not finished. I clicked to the final slide on the projector. I displayed the physical photographs I had taken of the gutted luxury condominiums on West Harbor Boulevard. I placed them side by side with the official intake rosters of real displaced veterans who were currently sleeping on aluminum cots in underfunded city shelters. I forced the board to look at the real names of the men and women whose identities had been stolen to legitimize this massive real estate fraud. It was no longer just an abstract white-collar crime involving manipulated spreadsheets. It was a grotesque, undeniable betrayal of human dignity and national gratitude. The final, fatal blow was the photocopy Martin had slipped into my pocket just minutes before the meeting. I projected the original budget proposal onto the massive screen. Right there in the margins, written in Talbot's distinct blue ink, was his explicit, handwritten directive to artificially inflate the project overhead by exactly 12% and to bypass the competitive bidding process for the shell companies. Talbot stammered wildly, his perfectly tailored suit suddenly looking completely suffocating. He frantically tried to blame a procedural misunderstanding, pointing fingers at negligent contractors and claiming he had been manipulated by his own subordinates. But the chain of evidence was a heavy steel vault, and the door had just slammed completely shut. His own handwriting, his own internet protocol address, and his own voice had systematically destroyed every single avenue of plausible deniability. The board of directors, utterly terrified of the impending federal fallout and desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive executive, voted immediately. They suspended Grant Talbot on the spot, froze every single project file in the building, entirely canceled the executive bonus pool, and formally requested an immediate criminal investigation by the state authorities. I did not need to scream at him. I did not need to demand an apology or gloat over his destruction. I just stood completely still, watching the man who had tried to bury me get entirely crushed beneath the unbearable weight of the very paperwork he had weaponized against others. The profound, lingering emotional closure did not happen in that boardroom. It happened 4 weeks later, on a quiet, heavily overcast Tuesday morning. I pushed through the glass doors of the Blue Lantern Diner, the familiar smell of burnt coffee and fried onions washing over me. I walked toward my usual vinyl booth, but I stopped dead in my tracks. Sitting at the front counter, wearing his faded green jacket and old baseball cap, was General Hale. He was quietly eating a plate of scrambled eggs, reading a folded newspaper. I sat down in my booth, and the tired waitress immediately walked over with a steaming mug of black coffee. I reached into my purse for my wallet, but she shook her head and offered a small, knowing smile. She told me my bill had already been completely covered, along with the meals for the 3 older veterans sitting at the far end of the counter. I looked over at the general. He did not turn around to acknowledge me. He simply raised his ceramic coffee mug slightly into the air, a silent, unwavering salute from a man who understood exactly what it meant to fight in the dark. I wrapped my hands around my warm mug, a deep, settling peace, finally taking root in my chest. I finally understood that the absolute strongest, most devastating form of revenge is never found in making a loud, chaotic scene. True revenge is having the patience to gather your ammunition, the courage to bring the ugly truth into the glaring public light at the exact right moment, and ensuring the people who tried to destroy you never get the chance to stand back up again. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to share your thoughts and let us connect. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and show your incredible support by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people around the world.